Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your guest host, Cole McNeely. Established in 2019 by the Franklin News Foundation, the Center Square publishes original, taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insight to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Devungi, PhD economist. Today, we'll look at proposed deregulation and the EPA. We'll discuss the auto-deletion of instant messages between government officials in Washington state. And we'll hear about new information on Hillary Clinton's role in promoting the idea of a Trump-Russia collusion in 2016. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
What does freedom look like tomorrow? On the Future of Freedom podcast, we explore the principles behind our nation's founding freedoms and the policies required to sustain those freedoms. Featuring thought leaders and policy experts, each episode dives deep into debates around how to protect these principles now and into the future. Subscribe to the Future of Freedom wherever you get your podcasts and be part of the conversation.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Cole McNeely. With more on efforts by the EPA to pull back on some regulations, it's Dan McCaleb.
President Donald Trump's Environmental Protection Agency is proposing rolling back Obama-era regulations on greenhouse gas emissions. Lee Zeldin, administrator of the EPA, said this week that the administration is looking to rescind the 2009 endangerment finding, which directly led to the Biden administration's electric vehicle mandate, pushing to reduce the production of gas-powered vehicles. Joining me to discuss this is the Center Square regional editor, Steve Wilson. Steve, what is the 2009 endangerment finding, and what does the EPA's plan to rescind it mean for everyday Americans?
Well, what it is a finding that says that greenhouse gases are a pollutant. And that doesn't sound like a big deal. It really is, because what that's meant is these car manufacturers have had to reduce the amount of CO2 coming out of your tailpipes. And how have they done that? They have scaled down these motors. It used to be 10 years ago, you could get a V6 in just about any just basic family car. Toyota Camry, Chevrolet Impala, which by the way no longer exists, Honda Accord, Nissan Altima. But now they've had to downsize engines. They've had to go to these turbo 4s. They've had to go to hybrids. For example, look at the Toyota Camry. 10 years ago, you could get an optional V6 for $31,500. And the car started with just a non-turbo 4-cylinder at about $23,000. Now it's all hybrid. You don't have a choice. It used to be the hybrid was just an option. Now it starts at $28,400, and the range topping version is $34,600, and that's got a hybrid. So you don't have any choice. You're just stuck with a smaller engine, and these smaller engines are trying to pull around bigger cars and are trying to do the work that a bigger V6 or back in the day a V8 would do. And I think the problem is for the consumer is that these engines, they can get better gas mileage, but you have to drive with a very light foot. And also they're more expensive to repair. They probably don't last as long. The hybrids, even though it's not an electric where you have to totally tear the car apart to get the batteries out, you're still going to have to replace those batteries probably about the 200,000 mile mark. So you've got this brings a lot of issues. But the thing I will say, this is not going to happen overnight. You're not going to see V6s and Camrys tomorrow. The auto industry, it takes years for them to work on these cars, and it's going to take several years for this to filter down. My guess is they're going to wait and see what happens with the next presidential election before they start making product decisions from an engineering standpoint.
So no immediate impact on consumers, but there could be a longer term impact, as you say, depending on what happens with the next presidential election. the Trump administration has said that this Obama era emissions regulation led to the EV mandate that came out under the Biden administration. Although American consumers have shown less and less proclivity to buy EVs, yes, there was a run on electric vehicle purchases early on, but after that initial run, electric vehicle sales have slowed somewhat. Does this impact that at all, you think?
I think with electric vehicles, consumers are finding that there's a lot of inconvenience. There's that range anxiety, which you look at even the best electric vehicle, they say they have a 300-mile range. Well, that's with a lot of caveats. If it's very hot outside, like I live in coastal Mississippi, it's hotter than the surface of the sun. The car actually has to keep the cooling on and use battery power to keep the batteries within the correct temperature range. So that's an issue. So that cuts your range. If it's very cold, that cuts your range. And then it's finding a charging station. I mean, it takes 5 minutes to fill up a big truck with a big gas tank. Whereas with an electric car, the best case scenario at a fast charger is maybe 30 minutes and maybe an 80% charge. And if you look at the instruction manuals of some of these electric cars, it actually says not to do this too often because it can damage the battery.
And then you have the issue of infrastructure. There has been a push to build more electric charging stations or whatever. But when you get into, like middle America, the Midwest and further out west where you've got these vast open spaces, that infrastructure doesn't really exist. Not to the point where there's enough charging stations. So that's another issue.
As someone who almost ran out of gas in Southwest Texas in between towns can attest, you do not want to be in that scenario. But I think another thing with the electric cars that's really cramped the consumer enthusiasm for them is they're expensive and they're inconvenient, and people want something that they can just go and do what they need to do. Because if you want to charge your electric vehicle to its full capacity at home, you've got to have an electrician install a 240 kilovolt plug in there, and that's not cheap. I mean, you're talking probably $1,000 to $2,000. So this requires a lot of investment on the part of the consumer. They've got to plan their life around finding charging stations because not all of them work. Some of them are down for maintenance. So it's an issue. And I think this is going to help to where they're going to let the market decide. If electric cars are better and consumers think they're better, fine. But the federal government won't be mandating that we have to have these as our primary transportation.
Steve, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Dan and Steve. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. With more on the auto-deletion of messages between government officials and Washington State, it's TJ Martinell.
With me is Carly Johnson. So there is the end of a 6-month suspension of a policy that for years allowed for the auto-deletion of Microsoft Teams or instant messages at Washington State agencies after 1 week, and it's quickly approaching. So the question is whether or not that's going to be continued. Carleen, what's going on?
This is all related to the Open Records Act, and it was February 17th this year when Governor Ferguson issued a directive to all state agencies and employees that said, okay, stop. You got to refigure your computer, stop using the auto delete function after 7 days on all of your Teams chat conversations. Now we use that, right? Between colleagues with the Center Square. Ours is a little bit of a different format through Google Chat, but those side conversations like, hey, TJ, what are you working on? Or who's that source? Send me the contact information. A lot of that stuff is, pretty innocuous, but the problem is that state agency employees on every level have been using Microsoft Teams for, the suggestion is a lot more than just transitory conversations like, hey, what do you want to get for lunch today? So, In February, when there was a settlement that had to be paid out because DSHS was refusing to turn over public records, there was a subsequent lawsuit and they got slapped with a big fine, $225,000 fine. That's when Governor Ferguson said, okay, let's take a pause on this. Don't destroy any of these Teams chats, conversations for at least 6 months. Well, August 17th marks the expiration of that little 6-month pause ordered by the governor. The question is now, what will he do? And they're not telling us, TJ. I reached out multiple times this week. Washington Coalition for Open Government, which, fights for transparency in government, has been trying to find out what's going to happen. They're not getting a response from the governor's office either.
I suspect what will happen is we'll find out the day. He'll have a press conference the day that it's set to expire, and he'll come out with whatever he's going to say. But I'm guessing he doesn't have any incentive to make a decision before he has to about that.
That's a good point. Yeah, without much pressure, I'm guessing that, other than Washcog's emails inquiring and my follow-up emails this week when I wrote my article, they probably haven't, everybody's just kind of forgot about this. Like, big deal. The assumption is those side conversations in Microsoft Teams are, TJ, let's go out, let's get a sandwich. Let's go to that favorite place, whatever. Okay. If it's all that, and governor refers to those as transitory conversations. And by the way, there's no definition offered by the governor as what a transitory conversation is.
I think the problem is here's the thing. It's not the government's job to decide whether or not a record is important. If we have someone say I'll give an example. Let's say I interview somebody over something. They say, yeah, that day I was doing this, but the chat record shows that they were actually doing something else. That's them. That's a contradiction between what they said they did and what they actually did. And so, right. And the reality is these are public records. They may be innocuous. They may be of no value. They're still public records.
And we're talking about millions of pieces of information here, millions of these side conversations. I mean, on any given day, you go back and look at your chats. I've probably got 50 in any given day, between our editors.
But that's also where people have conversations about stuff.
There you go.
And again, it's not the government's job to decide whether or not the public should value these records. They are public records. And if people don't like that, then don't go work in the public sector. I've explained this to people who work for government, who don't understand. I said, your communications are my property because I pay taxes and I don't really have a choice whether I pay taxes. And your job is funded by taxpayers. Whereas those who work in the private sector, we have to get people to voluntarily give us money for the services that we provide. You don't. That's why your stuff is all subject to public records requests.
That's right.
Because we own it. And so for the government to say, these records aren't important. Well, that's not up really for you to decide unless there's some important reason to exempt a public record. They're still public records. It's a question of whether they should be released to the public. They're not arguing, and nobody's arguing that these records are containing sensitive information. They're actually arguing the exact opposite. It's almost like a horseshoe theory where they're saying it's so unimportant that we shouldn't keep them. Well, right. I can understand someone saying, hey, this contains information that's really important. And it's also releasing it could have negative consequences. So, at the very least, we're not, and then they do that all the time for different types of stuff to protect people's sensitive information, their personally identifiable information, like obviously social security numbers.
Protected.
Yeah. But when it comes to, and if they want to redact those chats where people contain sensitive information, that makes sense. But simply doing this broad brush of, we don't think that these records are worth keeping. Not up for you to decide. Sorry, that's not how it works.
Right. And here's what's super interesting. So Washington Coalition for Open Government, there's a couple of lawsuits with this, a private citizen by the name of Jamie Nixon, who I interviewed, long an advocate for open government, former communications worker in a state agency. So, the guy's been on both sides of this. He's handled the public records requests that come from the media or private citizens, right? And now he's on the other side saying, you can't do this. It was in 2021 when all state agencies, or 90% of them basically, adopted this Microsoft Teams 7-day auto deletion period. Well, my question is why? Why make it every 7 days all of these conversations are gone? Certainly the suggestion there from the outside is you got something to hide, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah, 7-day auto deletion. I'm like, sorry, how is that legal?
Well, that's the question. Here's the thing. So at the time, Attorney General Bob Ferguson, now our governor, at the time, there are emails and conversations that Washington Coalition for Open Government has obtained through, ironically, public records requests that show Ferguson was saying, this ain't going to fly. We're going to be in violation of Washington State's Public Records Act. This will not fly. He suggested they don't implement a 7-day auto delete on Teams chats messages. Okay. Well, they ended up adopting it in 2021. It's been a thing for now over 4 years.
Fine.
And now he ended up, though, last year in 2024, when one of these lawsuits I referenced went to Thurston County Superior Court, it was then still AG Bob Ferguson who defended DSHS over their unwillingness to release records and over their, saying these records are destroyed. And so then he fought that. And then DSHS gets slapped with this giant fine. And so then he has to say, okay, wait, let's hold off on deleting these for at least 6 months. Let's figure out if this is a good idea.
Thanks, Carlene. Listeners can keep up with this story and others at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to TJ and Carlene. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. With more on Hillary Clinton, we'll go back to Dan McCaleb.
In an explosive new report, declassified documents from the intelligence community indicate that Hillary Clinton, her 2016 presidential campaign managers, and a top member of a George Soros group plotted to fabricate the Trump-Russia collusion hoax to distract the public from Clinton's email scandal. Joining me to discuss this is the Center Square's congressional reporter, Therese Budro. Therese, you wrote about these declassified documents that were released Thursday. Tell us about them.
Yeah, so these documents are just the latest in a slew of other related material that Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, has released over the past few days and the week prior that really paint a bad picture of certain higher-up members in the Obama administration, including former President Barack Obama himself, Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State for part of his term, and then of course, ran against Trump and lost in 2016, and other members of the intelligence community, Clapper, Comey, etc. So these documents that were just released, it's important to note first off that the content in the documents, the members who are involved, they deny writing these emails and making these appointments. So it's important to say that right off the bat. But what these documents show, and this is the documents, they're part of the Durham annex. So essentially it was a classified part of the annex on the Durham report that was previously classified, and shows what are some of the steps that investigative departments related to the Department of Justice took looking into all of this Russia stuff. So essentially these documents include what look like emails between Leonard Bernardo, who is the vice president of a George Soros group, the Open Society Foundation. And it looks like there are these emails, pictures of his emails, where he is writing to an undisclosed member of Clinton's campaign staff in 2016, so late July of 2016. And he's talking about all of this new stuff that's coming out about Russian hacking attempts in election infrastructure. And he's saying, hey, I was talking with Julie, who probably means investigators think Julianne Smith, one of the head campaign advisors for Clinton, says, I was talking with Julie and we think that we should use this to, quote, demonize Trump, use this and tie the Russia's attempts to influence Americans' view of the election integrity. That was the only thing that was really confirmed. He said we should tie it with Trump. We should make a story that, hey, Russia is doing this on behalf of Trump to get Trump to win, and they're trying to hack the polls and to paint Hillary in a bad light. And he said we should do this because it will essentially distract the public from Clinton's own email scandal. In the article, he says, quote, Hillary is hardly a good looking candidate as far as credibility is concerned. The point is, still quote, the point is making Russia play a U.S. domestic issue. Say something like a critical infrastructure threat for the election to feel menace, since both POTUS and VPOTUS, which means President of the United States or Vice President of the United States, have acknowledged the fact that the intelligence community would speed up searching for evidence, meaning evidence that Trump and Russia, there was a collusion, that is regrettably still unavailable, end quote. So it looks like they were really pushing for this. And apparently Hillary Clinton herself approved of the plan. That's what he said in a follow-up email to, again, a person that isn't disclosed. There's a lot of the recipients and the people talking are redacted. And so again, if this stuff is true, it's very, very much not a good look for Hillary or her advisors or any of the people involved, because it really seems like there was a coordinated effort to also get the FBI on their side to speed up this process and to find ways to tie Trump to Russia, as a sort of Russia collusion hoax, which again, we now know to be false.
So a couple things here. Leonard Bernardo worked for George Soros' Open Society Foundation. George Soros, of course, is a billionaire funder of Democrats across the country. Bernardo himself says he had no recollection of sending these emails. Hillary Clinton was involved in her own scandal. When as Secretary of State, she used a private computer and private email address to send official government emails and whatnot. Those were deleted. There was a big investigation of that, just to refresh viewers or listeners' minds there. But now, in this Russian collusion hoax with President or then candidate Donald Trump was widespread story in the media, but is long since been debunked. But now it looks like there was collusion on the Democrat side to push this story. Is that essentially what's going on here?
Yes. Yeah. That's a good summary of it. Again, if these documents are true, that is what happened, is that the Democrats, if the documents are true, then the Democrats, there was a very obvious push to link Trump, whether that was true or not, whether evidence was found or not, to Putin, to Russia, and try to delegitimize Trump's win if he won. And just overall paint him in a bad light, put him in a bad light.
In the few seconds we have left, Therese, what's next? Where do we go from here? Is Congress picking up this investigation? What happens next?
Well, given that the Senate Judiciary Committee declassified this, that document there, those documents there, the others have been declassified by Gabbard. I think I would be shocked if there wasn't some kind of investigation, that goes on. FBI Director Kash Patel said that more documents in that vein will be released. So my guess, I don't know for sure, but my guess is that there are going to be more documents released, and that as soon as that flurry is concluded for the most part, lawmakers or different agencies in the Trump administration, maybe the Department of Justice, are going to start making official inquiries and possibly have people Obama and Clinton maybe even come and testify. We really don't know, but it's looking to be building up into something pretty big.
Thank you for joining us today, Therese. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Therese. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. What's the latest on tariffs and trade deals? Why is one lawmaker introducing legislation to limit the influence of the National Education Association? And what motivates the wealthy to keep working? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Cole McNeely. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. 4 people were killed in a shooting Monday night in a Manhattan high-rise. The gunman died on the scene of a self-inflicted gun wound, authorities said. The victims included an off-duty New York City police officer who was working security in the building. The shooter, who was armed with an AR-15 assault-style rifle, was apparently targeting the NFL offices in the building, according to Mayor Eric Adams. Adam said a note was found in the shooter's pocket listing grievances with the NFL and saying he suffered from CTE, a disease linked to head trauma. He played competitive football in his youth, authorities said. Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern plan to create America's first transcontinental railroad through a merger connecting over 50,000 route miles across 43 states from the East Coast to the West Coast. They said the effort will link about 100 ports across North America and will allow them to compete more effectively with Canadian railroads to win back U.S. freight volume and American jobs. President Donald Trump has made revitalizing American manufacturing a top priority of his second term. The companies say Tuesday's announcement advances those efforts. North Carolina is the 18th state to define men and women via state law, turning back one of 8 vetoes from first-term Democratic Governor Josh Stein. The General Assembly in both chambers garnered the required 3/5 majority to override a veto of the Prevent Sexual Exploitation of Women and Minors bill. 2 of the leading voices for protecting women's spaces in the nation, Tennessee Riley Gaines in North Carolina and Peyton McNabb, were thankful and pivotal to the cause. House Bill 805 not only defines male and female in state law for the clarity in legal and policy matters, but it also prohibits gender transitions paid for by taxpayers involving prisoners and minors. Parents' rights to no materials being shown to their children in school is also upheld in the legislation. It also protects girls' private spaces and sleeping quarters on overnight school trips. Months after Governor Gretchen Whitmer called for Michigan to adopt legislation addressing cell phones in schools, Democrats defeated a bill in the state house that would have done just that. Republican State Representative Mark Tisdale sponsored House Bill 4141. It needed 56 votes to pass the Republican-held House, but only received 53. Tisdale blamed politics for the bill's failure. No Democrats voted to support the bill, despite several expressing support for it before voting. Polling shows there is broad support for banning cell phones in classrooms, with some exceptions. In Louisiana, the man being sought in connection with a hit and run that hospitalized 5 juveniles has a lengthy criminal record, and dozens of his charges were previously refused by Orleans Parish prosecutors. Brian Johnson has been booked on more than 40 charges since 2021, including at least 10 counts of illegally carrying weapons, battery, possession of stolen property, resisting an officer, and distribution-level drug charges. Court records show that at least 24 of those charges were refused by District Attorney Jason Williams' office before trial. The case underscores growing criticism of Williams' charging decisions, particularly for defendants with violent or weapons-related records. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Cole McNeely. With more on this week's trade deals, it's Brett Rowland.
Joining me today is Andrew Rice from our national team. How are you doing, Andrew?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. So the biggest news today on tariffs is the extension of talks with Mexico. Tell us what Trump has said about this and why this deal is different than some of the others that he's been able to reach in recent weeks.
Right. So Trump announced via his social media platform, Truth Social, that he had a conversation with the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, and they are extending tariff talks for at least another 90 days. He did leave open the possibility that it could take longer than that. So they're extending talks for reaching an official trade deal for another 90 days. However, the tariffs are still kept in place on certain imported products. So the 25% tariff against Canada and Mexico on fentanyl across the northern and southern borders, that will still apply. Mexico will still pay that 25% tariff, as well as a 25% tariff on cars imported and a 50% tariff on steel, aluminum, and copper that Trump has been working on in recent days. This is different from a lot of other conversations because this is the first announcement of an extension, and there could be more extensions moving forward as this deadline approaches coming forward for tariff deals.
That's very interesting that he would, he sort of, signaled that there was some special, considerations that he was taking into account when he deals with Mexico from his Truth Social post this morning. And it's just one of a string of deals he's reached this week. And we've also seen a few more threats as that August 1st, deadline comes up. So we saw threats for Brazil, and I think it was, one other country,
Yes, for threats against India. Yes, there were also threats against India. There's 25% tariff threat against India, as well as a potential additional penalty for India's collaboration with Russia in getting military equipment as well as energy. So, India is part of the BRICS block of nations. That includes, it's India, South Africa, Brazil, and Russia and China. So Trump really does seem to be targeting this block of nations. He did say that they are attempting to devalue the US dollar, and try to make it less significant in the global economy. So it is really interesting how he's going after India as well. And so it provides some interesting context. I do know there's also additional threats domestically. So what have you heard in this new tariff case that's being talked about domestically?
So in court today, there's 11 judges, 3 lawyers, and they're all talking about tariffs. The hearing is going on as we speak. It's Thursday while we're recording this. So in this case, a group of states and, some small businesses have challenged Trump's authority to even implement tariffs in the first place. So the argument is over a 1977 law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. So Trump has done the bulk of his tariffs under that one single emergency act, which says a couple things, one of which you must have an emergency. Now, Trump's emergency here is, as you mentioned earlier, Andrew, the fentanyl trafficking, illegal migrant crossings, but also, he's saying that trade deficits in themselves are an emergency. Essentially that we've reached this tipping point where, American military readiness, American manufacturing are all on the line. And if these, industries aren't helped in some way, that they'll go away and America won't be able to compete on a world stage with its military. And that these trade deficits will essentially erode the foundations of the country. Now, the judges had some tough questions about some of these arguments. They had tough questions for everyone who was in the room. So they had tough questions for the states. They had tough questions for the small businesses. And they also had really tough questions for, the government. The administration's position here is that Trump has this or almost unbounded authority to issue tariffs when he likes. The opposing sides, those small businesses and states, are arguing that Trump doesn't have that authority and that the power to tax or tariff or it lies with Congress. So there's some real debate over what's going to happen next. Based on what I've heard this morning, I have no idea where this ruling is going to go. But I did talk to some experts yesterday who said that they expect a pretty quick ruling here. So that we won't be waiting a year or two on this, but maybe a couple of weeks, because essentially this is being fast tracked because of its importance to the economy. I think that's all the time we have for today. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me. Listeners can keep up with these stories and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you to Brett and Andrew. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. With more on legislation aimed at reducing the influence of the National Education Association, it's Esther Wickham.
Tennessee Republican U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn recently introduced her second bill this month targeting the nation's largest teacher union, the National Education Association. Joining us to dive a little bit deeper into this is Associate Editor for the state of Tennessee and Georgia, Kim Jarrett. Kim.
Hi, Esther. So yes, Senator Blackburn introduced this week. This was the second bill in a month that she introduced targeting the National Education Association. What this bill does, she's basically saying, we're asking you to file a piece of paper with Congress that says you are not influencing politics. She claims that they're a very partisan organization and she wants to stop that. What is so interesting is the penalty for this is that if they don't file this paperwork, if this bill passes, they would have their charter revoked, which was what she wanted to do in the first bill, which she co-sponsored with North Carolina's Mark Harris, which I know you wrote about as well. So that's in a way, she has two ways to try to feel like she's going to attack their charter. Is one, if you don't file this paperwork that says you're not influencing Congress and you don't do this, then that's the penalty. And then she has one that just outright wants to revoke the National Education Association's charter.
Yeah. And, going a little deeper into this, Congress, said that they established the NEA in 1906. So this has been around for over 100 years. And it started out with the goal of having American teachers be supported and strengthening schools. And a lot of these senators and lawmakers are saying that the current NEA has abandoned that mission and they are, quote unquote, supporting radical leftist agendas. Could you go a little bit deeper into specifically what has the NEA done to take these actions of these bills to revoke their charter?
I'll quote what Senator Blackburn said and some of the things that she said in her news release and meetings. She talks about how the NEA gives most of their money to Democratic candidates, but the NEA has teachers that are members of the organization who are Republican and independents. She quotes one story that says 2/3 of NEA members are actually not Democrats, yet she shows that, hey, they're giving all of their money, most of their money to Democratic candidates. She also says that they support a lot of LGBTQ curriculum. And one of the things that she noted in her second news release was she said that, well, back when we had COVID and we were trying to reopen the schools, the NEA and the American Federation of Teachers got together with the Biden administration and tried to come up with all these plans about how we're going to do school during COVID. Republicans have said, hey, we wanted the schools open. There have been studies that have shown there's been learning loss because of the schools closing during COVID. And this is one of her sticking points with the NEA.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, the story that I had covered, a few weeks ago when they first announced the first bill to revoke the charter, Corey DeAngelis, who's a senior fellow at the American Culture Project, basically exposed the NEA on X, posting a thread of the NEA's resolutions at their annual convention. And a lot of them were, saying that they would defend democracy against Trump's quote unquote fascism. They kind of changed the language of deporting illegal immigrants to kidnapping. So the NEA opposes ICE, from kidnapping, students and leaders and supporting students, that want to organize raids against ICE. And so in response to this, after DeAngelis had kind of exposed them, the NEA blocked him on X. And even for me as a reporter, reaching out to the NEA, I have not gotten a response or comment about any of this stuff. So you can kind of see that there are these things that are coming about their reputation and actions that they're taking, but they have no response to them. Aside from the first bill, there were 15 co-sponsors, House representatives, specifically lawmakers that are supporting this. Within your reporting, what other organizations have been in support of this bill? What are they saying about this bill, and specifically the NEA?
Well, there have been several education organizations, Moms for Liberty, the Heritage Action, Young America's Foundation. They've been supporting Blackburn's efforts. And Tina, I cannot say her last name. One of the CEO, Moms for Liberty, says the NEA's embrace of radical left policies and anti-Semitism combined with their rejection of pro rights has forced moms and dads across the country to condemn this organization. So they've had a lot of strong words for the NEA. There's a lot of discussion about the funding of the NEA, and it has this congressional seal of approval, and it's had it since 1906. So it's not, Blackburn is basically representing people who are talking to her and saying, hey, we have some concerns. So that's why she's introducing these bills.
Yeah, so we'll see. It's an ongoing story. I know that there was a U.S. representative in Wisconsin, Scott Fitzgerald, as well as Senator Jim Banks from Indiana, tried to previously revoke their charter back in 2022, and they were unable to. So now this is kind of a new initiative. I feel like this is getting a lot more traction. So Kim, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and explaining this and breaking this down a little bit more. And if you'd like to continue to follow this story or any other education related stories, listeners can go to thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Esther and Kim. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. With more on the economic incentives of the wealthy, it's Chris Krug.
Oh, you and I trade a lot of stories back and forth. We were just sort of challenging each other to read things that we don't think we would otherwise be reading. You sent me a story from Discourse that I thought was really interesting. Discourse magazine. But the headline on this was Understanding the quote unquote wealthy working class. Affluent Americans care more about the quality of their consumption than its quantity. That's still a very highbrow headline, right? What this story comes down to is that, if you think that wealthy people don't work a lot or hard and didn't work a lot or hard to become wealthy people, you may be wrong. And in fact, let me read the lead to you because the lead is very good. If you were to ask a layperson what a wealthy American does in a typical day, they might describe a life in the lap of luxury. It's easy to picture someone who lives off the income generated by the hard work of others, enjoying a leisurely lifestyle without engaging in any labor themselves. I think a lot of people do think about it in those terms. But the fact of the matter is that, and this is from the panel study of income dynamics, which is focused exclusively on U.S. households, that wealthy Americans, and I'm stealing straight from the story here, and this is written, I've taken enough of this. Domenico Ferraro, okay, is the author of this. Wealthy Americans, he writes this, wealthy Americans work as much as or more than the less affluent ones. They're just as likely to have jobs, work nearly the same number of hours each week, and maintain a similar number of working weeks throughout the year. So they're not taking 10 weeks off a year. They're not working from 12 to 12:15 and then heading over to the club for a sandwich. So tell me your takeaway and why you wanted to talk about this story.
I think it's important. It's important for not only people to know that, right? Look, America wasn't built, wealth in America isn't built most of it is not inherited. Like, you had kings and queens in Europe, for example, that just passed down their wealth and these noble classes, right? You don't have that. You didn't really have that in America. People in America really worked really hard to build wealth. And the reality is they continue to do so. They continue to do so for various number of reasons. The first one is once they have kind of their basic needs met, they want more quality. They want better quality foods. They want better quality items. So that's how they consume, right? And so, you're a millionaire, but your neighbors are billionaires and you're like, hey, they have nicer things and I want nicer things. And so that's how we are as a human race. And we continue to strive for better quality stuff, not necessarily more stuff, because this article actually highlights that the rich actually just consume just as much as you do. Most of us do. Right.
But the difference being that and this is in the article if you're going to have a steak and you're a regular person, someone who's wealthy might have a Wagyu A5 ribeye, that costs $235 a pound or something like that. Right. But it's the same. It's a piece of meat.
It's ultimately they're consuming the same quantity of stuff. Right. There's only so much they can eat. Right. And it's just, they are going to offer better quality, which is relatively more expensive.
Yeah.
But it has strong implications for policy, right? Like, you have some people saying, well, we should tax the rich more.
Well, let's talk about that. And let me give you a setup because the kicker on this op-ed, I think, is really, really good. And it starts with the subhead that says, does quality versus quantity matter? Okay. Here's what he wrote. Rethinking how wealth affects people's willingness to work is one of the most crucial aspects of well-designed government policy. Consider tax policy, specifically how progressive and personal income tax should be. Conventional wisdom, too often abused in some policy circles, which suggest imposing a very high tax rate on those at the top of the income and wealth ladder. This logic critically hinges on the presumption that wealthy individuals assign little value to an extra unit of consumption, so that taxing their incomes implies rather small or negligible adverse supply effects. But this logic is based on the quote unquote more is better view of consumption. However, in our world, where it's the quality of consumption that matters, conventional logic falls short and may mislead policymakers into believing that work incentives are no longer important for those at the top.
Exactly.
It's really sharp. I think it's really very sharp thinking. I mean,
exactly.
If you, like, I guess though, if you believe that, you know, that people who are, you know, who are successful have somehow just like been, born that way. And there are a lot of people that have been born both in third place and home and third base and home plate, right? There's a lot of people that have been born on third base or even farther down the base path, closer to home plate. But I think those are the exceptions to the rules. You talked about kings and queens. We don't have kings and queens in the United States.
The share of people who just inherited is much smaller, right?
Yes.
You know, and that's the bottom line. And so for most people, most of us, it's hard work. You know, you get up early, you do extra work. I look at everyone around me, and most people around me are working sometimes 10 hours, 12 hours a day, right? Working at weird hours. And so,
well, I'm working Saturdays and Sundays and I'm in
Sundays.
All right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's, and in particular, I mean, if you're a business captain or a business owner, you know, if you have stewardship over a large organization, and the work that you do, primarily like the strategic work that you do to navigate your company through what is a changing and evolving scenario, no matter what it is, whether you make, you know, brass tacks or you build battleships. I mean, there are a lot of things in between there, and you're subject to whatever's happening in the marketplace. But this story I thought was, and this is, I call it a story. This is an essay. It's an op-ed. It's very well written. It's not taxing from the standpoint of your time.
It is based on real data, and the real data says that incentives matter. You can't assume that, more consumption is always better. And because you know what? Quality matters too.
Yes.
Like maybe quality matters more. And that essentially everyone from the bottom up, as their incomes grow, want more and more quality. They want better and better stuff. And so they're just as responsive to tax policy incentives as everyone else, right? If you jack up the rate at the top, well, guess what? You're going to have similar consequences. And if you were taxing the middle class at a higher rate, people respond to tax incentives by basically pulling back, having to pull back, being forced to pull back, or to find loopholes and other ways to avoid the taxman, right? And that's essentially the bottom line. And like you said, I love the story because it's just based on real data, and it's insightful. It's full of insights about, you know, the dynamic impact of tax policy changes.
Thank you, Chris and Orfe. And that'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find your podcast. I'm Cole McNeely, and on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.